The last thing Silas Drummond's father said before he died wasn't "I love you." It was, "Don't open that cabin." Now Silas stood in front of the oak door that had been nailed shut and sealed with red wax since 1947. 77 years of silence. Above the frame, his grandfather had carved a warning into the wood. What's buried should stay buried. But this land was his now, and the men who wanted to buy it were willing to do anything to make sure he never opened that door. He opened it anyway. What he found inside brought justice to 17 families silenced for decades. Subscribe to see how. The funeral was small. Silas counted 11 people in the chapel, and half of them were there because they worked for the funeral home. His father, Robert Drummond, had spent the last 30 years of his life making sure no one got too close. No friends, no community ties, just the land, the silence, and whatever secret he'd been guarding until the cancer finally took him. Silas stood at the graveside as they lowered the casket into Texas dirt that had been in his family for 4 generations. The preacher said something about rest and peace, but Silas wasn't listening. He was thinking about the last conversation they had had in the hospital room 3 days before his father died. Robert's hand had been cold when he grabbed Silas's wrist. His voice was barely a whisper, but the words came out sharp and clear. "Don't open that cabin," he'd said. "Don't let them know you're still alive." Silas had tried to ask who they were, but his father's eyes had closed and he never opened them again. Now Silas stood alone in the cemetery watching the workers fill in the grave, and he still didn't know what his father had been so afraid of. But he was about to find out. The ranch was an hour outside of town, 640 acres of scrub grass and limestone hills that stretched toward the horizon like something out of an old western. Silas hadn't been back here since he was a kid. His father had moved them to Austin when Silas was 12, and they'd never talked about why. The house was still standing, a lone stone structure with a metal roof that had rusted in patches. Behind it, past the old barn and the cattle pens that hadn't held livestock in decades, was the cabin. Silas saw it from a distance. First, a small square building made of oak logs that had gone dark with age. Even from 50 yards away, he could see the boards nailed across the door. He walked closer, his boots kicking up dust on the path his grandfather must have walked 1,000 times. The door was sealed, not just locked or boarded up, but sealed. Someone had driven 8-inch nails through oak planks and hammered them into the frame, then poured red wax over the edges like they were sealing a tomb. Silas ran his hand over the wax. It was hard and cracked, but still intact. Above the door, carved deep into the wood with what looked like a hunting knife, were 7 words. "What's buried should stay buried." The letters were uneven, jagged, like whoever carved them had been in a hurry or scared or both. Silas stepped back and looked at the cabin. The windows were boarded too. No one had been inside this place since 1947. That's what the date stamped into the wax seal said. 1947. The year his grandfather Jasper Drummond had disappeared from town and was never seen again. Silas walked around the cabin slowly looking for any other way in. There wasn't one. The back wall was solid. The roof was intact. Whoever had sealed this place had done it right. He pulled out his phone and took pictures of the door, the seal, the carving. Then he noticed something else. On the ground near the base of the cabin, half buried in the dirt, was a rusted tobacco tin. Silas knelt down and dug it out with his fingers. Inside was a small black and white photograph protected by a piece of oilcloth. The image was faded, but he could still make out 2 men standing side by side in front of this same cabin. One of them was white, tall, with a hard face and work clothes. The other was younger, dark-haired, with a kind smile. On the back of the photo, someone had written in pencil, "Jasper and Raphael, 1946. Silas stared at the photo for a long time. His grandfather and someone named Raphael, friends by the look of it. But who was Raphael, and why had this photo been buried? He slipped it into his jacket pocket and stood up. That's when he heard the sound of tires on gravel. A black SUV was coming up the ranch road, moving slowly like the driver was looking for something. Silas walked back toward the house, keeping his eyes on the vehicle. It stopped about 100 yards away near the gate. The engine idled. The windows were tinted so he couldn't see who was inside. For a full minute, nothing happened. Then the SUV backed up, turned around, and drove away. Silas watched until it disappeared behind the ridge. His father's words came back to him. "Don't let them know you're still alive." That night, Silas went through his father's papers in the house. There wasn't much. A deed to the land, some old tax records, a safety deposit box key with no bank name on it. And at the bottom of a drawer, wrapped in a faded dish towel, was a reel-to-reel tape recorder. It was old, the kind they used in the 40s and 50s, with heavy metal reels and a microphone jack on the side. Silas turned it over in his hands. The machine was dusty, but solid. There was no tape on the reels. He set it on the table and kept looking. In the closet he found a box of his grandfather's things, a belt, a pair of work gloves, a journal with only 3 pages filled in, all of them about cattle prices and weather. Nothing that explained the cabin or the seal or the warning carved into the door. Silas sat on the porch as the sun went down and looked out at the land. Somewhere out there beyond the hills and the dry creek beds, someone was watching. Someone who didn't want him here. Someone who knew what was inside that cabin. He thought about his father's fear, his grandfather's disappearance, and the photograph of 2 men who had once been friends. Then he thought about the carved words above the door. What's buried should stay buried. His father had believed that. He'd spent his whole life believing it. But Silas wasn't his father, and he was done running from ghosts. Tomorrow he'd go into town. He'd find out who Raphael was and why his grandfather had sealed that cabin 77 years ago. And then, no matter what his father had said, he was going to open it. The lawyer showed up at 8 in the morning. Silas was on the porch with coffee when he saw the silver sedan coming up the road, moving fast enough to kick up a long tail of dust. The car stopped in front of the house, and a man in a gray suit stepped out. He was in his mid-40s, clean-shaven, with the kind of smooth confidence that came from winning arguments for a living. He walked up to the porch without waiting for an invitation and extended his hand. "Hollis Kincaid," he said, "I represent the Barlow Land Trust." Silas didn't shake his hand. He just looked at him and waited. Kincaid lowered his hand slowly, his smile tightening just a fraction. "I'm here to make you an offer on this property," he said. "A very generous offer." Silas took a sip of his coffee. "I'm not selling," he said. Kincaid nodded like he'd expected that answer. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded document. "This is a purchase agreement for $1,200,000, he said. "That's more than twice what this land is worth on the open market. You could walk away today, start fresh somewhere else, and never have to think about this place again." Silas set his coffee down on the porch rail. "Why would anyone pay twice what it's worth?" he asked. Kincaid's smile didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. "Let's just say the Barlow family has a long history with this land," he said. "They'd like to see it returned to proper stewardship." Silas looked past him at the cabin in the distance. "And what happens if I say no?" he asked. Kincaid folded the document and put it back in his jacket. "Then you'd be making things difficult for yourself," he said. "There are things on this property that aren't good for anyone. You'd be smart to take the offer and leave." He walked back to his car without another word, got in, and drove away. Silas watched the dust settle on the road. Then he went inside, grabbed his keys, and headed into town. The town was called Carrizo Springs, population 3,000. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone and strangers got noticed. Silas parked on Main Street and walked into the first place that looked like it had been there a while. It was a small cafe with checkered curtains and a hand-painted sign that said Elodie's. Inside, the air smelled like coffee and bacon. An older woman stood behind the counter wiping down the surface with a rag. She looked up when Silas walked in and her hand stopped moving. For a moment, she just stared at him. Then she set the rag down and came around the counter. "You're Jasper's grandson," she said. It wasn't a question. Silas nodded. "How did you know?" he asked. She smiled, but it was a sad smile. "You look just like him," she said. "Same eyes, same way of standing. I'm Elodie Delgado. I've run this place for 40 years. She gestured toward a booth by the window. "Sit down," she said. "I'll get you some coffee." Silas sat, and she brought him a cup, then slid into the seat across from him. She folded her hands on the table and looked at him like she was deciding how much to say. "Your grandfather was a good man," she said finally. "Don't let anyone in this town tell you differently." Silas wrapped his hands around the coffee cup. "What happened to him?" he asked. Elodie glanced toward the window, then back at him. "There was a man who worked for him," she said. "Raphael Ortiz. He was one of the migrant workers who came through every season. But Raphael wasn't like the others. He stayed. He and your grandfather became friends. Real friends. Then one night in 1947, Raphael disappeared. And not long after that, so did your grandfather." Silas leaned forward. "What do you mean, disappeared?" he asked. Elodie's voice dropped lower. "The Barlows own most of this county," she said. "They own the land, the businesses, the politicians. Back then they owned even more. If someone crossed them, they didn't last long. Raphael was asking questions about land deeds, about families who'd lost their property. Then he vanished. People said your grandfather killed him, but I never believed it. Neither did Raphael's family, but they were too scared to say anything. Silas felt something cold settle in his chest. The Barlows, he said. Elodie nodded. Don't trust anyone with that name, she said. Not then, not now. They've been trying to buy up your family's land for decades. Your father wouldn't sell. And now they're coming for you. Silas drove back to the ranch slowly, his mind turning over everything Elodie had told him. Raphael Ortiz, a man who had asked questions and disappeared, a man his grandfather had been accused of killing, but the photograph he had found showed them standing together like brothers. Something didn't add up. When he pulled up to the house, he saw tire tracks in the dirt near the cabin, fresh ones. Someone had been here while he was gone. Silas got out and walked toward the cabin. The boards on the door were still nailed shut, but the ground around the building had been disturbed. Footprints, boot prints size 11 or 12. Someone had walked a full circle around the cabin, testing the boards, looking for a way in. Silas knelt down and ran his finger along one of the prints. It was deep, recent, made within the last hour. He stood and looked around. The hills were quiet, no cars, no movement, but he could feel it now the same way he'd felt it yesterday when the black SUV had stopped and watched. Someone was out there, someone who didn't want him digging into the past. He walked back to the house and locked the door behind him. That night he sat at the kitchen table with his father's papers spread out in front of him and the photograph of Jasper and Raphael propped against a coffee cup. He thought about the lawyer's offer, about Elodie's warning about the fresh boot prints around the cabin, and he thought about the words carved into the door. What's buried should stay buried. His father had believed that. But Silas was starting to think that whatever was buried in that cabin was the only thing that could explain why his family had been running for 77 years. Around midnight, he heard it, a sound outside, not loud, just a soft scraping near the back of the house. Silas stood slowly and moved to the window. He pulled the curtain back an inch and looked out into the darkness. For a moment, he saw nothing. Then a shadow moved near the cabin. Someone was out there. Someone was trying to get inside. Silas didn't sleep that night. He sat in the dark with his father's old hunting rifle across his lap and watched the cabin through the window until the sun came up. Whoever had been out there was gone by the time he went outside to check. But they'd left something behind. Near the back door of the cabin, someone had driven a metal stake into the ground. Tied to it was a dead rattlesnake, its body stretched out straight and its head severed cleanly. It was a message, the kind ranchers used to send each other in the old days when words weren't enough. Silas pulled the stake out of the ground and threw the whole thing into the brush. Then he drove back into town. He needed answers, and he had a feeling the man who could give them to him wasn't going to be hard to find. The Barlow building sat on the corner of Main and 3rd, a 3-story brick structure that housed the land trust offices on the top floor. Silas parked across the street and walked in through the front entrance. The receptionist looked up when he came through the door, and her smile faltered when she saw his face. She picked up the phone and spoke quietly into it. A moment later, a man appeared at the top of the stairs. He was in his mid-50s, silver-haired, with the kind of build that came from working outdoors when he was younger and sitting in offices now. He wore a tailored shirt with the sleeves rolled up and boots that probably cost more than Silas's truck. He came down the stairs slowly, his eyes locked on Silas the whole way. "You must be Robert's son," he said. "I'm Garrett Barlow." Silas didn't offer his hand. "I want to know why your people are watching my property," he said. Garrett smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said. "But since you're here, why don't you come upstairs? We should talk." He turned and walked back up the stairs without waiting for an answer. Silas followed. The office on the 3rd floor had windows that looked out over the whole town. Garrett walked to a table near the window and poured 2 glasses of whiskey from a crystal decanter. He held one out to Silas. Silas didn't take it. Garrett shrugged and set it down. "Your family's land," he said. "It's been in dispute for a long time. My great-grandfather had a claim on part of it back in the 40s. It was never properly resolved. I'm just trying to clean up an old business." Silas kept his voice level. "By sending a lawyer with threats and leaving dead snakes on my property," he said. Garrett's expression didn't change. "I don't know anything about snakes," he said, "but I do know your grandfather brought a lot of pain to this town. A man disappeared on his land, a good man, and your grandfather was the last person to see him alive. People here have long memories. If I were you, I'd take the offer and leave before those memories turn into something worse. Silas felt his jaw tighten. You're saying my grandfather killed someone, he said. Garrett picked up his glass and took a slow sip. I'm saying everyone in this town knows what happened, he said. Your grandfather murdered a migrant worker named Rafael Ortiz. He buried the body somewhere on that ranch and then he ran. Your father knew it too. That's why he stayed away. That's why he kept that cabin sealed. Because if anyone ever found out what was inside your family's name, would be finished. Silas took a step closer. If everyone knows he did it, why was there never a trial, he asked. Garrett set his glass down. Because the body was never found, he said. And because my family chose to let it go. We could have pressed charges, we could have taken that land through the courts, but we didn't. We showed mercy, and this is how your family repays us, by refusing to sell and stirring up old trouble. Silas stared at him for a long moment. Then he turned and walked toward the door. Before he left, he looked back. If anyone comes on my property again, he said, I'm calling the sheriff. Garrett smiled. The sheriff works for me, he said, but you go ahead and try. Silas drove straight to the county library. It was a small building next to the courthouse with rows of old filing cabinets in the back and a librarian who looked like she'd been there since the 50s. He asked for newspapers from 1947, and she brought him 3 boxes of microfilm. He spent 2 hours going through them page by page. Most of it was local news, cattle prices, and high school sports. Then he found it. A small article buried on page 6 of the October 9th edition. The headline read, Local Rancher Questioned in Disappearance of Migrant Worker. The article was only 3 paragraphs long. It said that a man named Rafael Ortiz had been reported missing by his family and that authorities had questioned a local rancher in connection with the disappearance. No charges were filed. The rancher's name wasn't mentioned in the article, but Silas knew who it was. He made copies of the article and drove back to the ranch. The sun was starting to set, and the sky over the hills was turning deep orange. When he pulled up to the house, he saw something that made him stop. The front window was broken. Glass covered the porch. Silas got out slowly and walked up the steps. On the floor just inside the window was a brick wrapped in a piece of paper. He picked it up and unfolded the paper. The message was written in block letters with a black marker. Leave while you still can. Silas crumpled the paper and threw it on the ground. Then he walked to the back of the house and grabbed a toolbox from the shed. He loaded it into the truck along with a crowbar, a flashlight, and bolt cutters. He wasn't leaving, and he wasn't waiting anymore. He drove to the cabin and parked in front of it. The sun was almost down now, and the shadows were long across the dirt. Silas stood in front of the sealed door and looked at the red wax, the nails, the carved warning above the frame. What's buried should stay buried. His father had believed that, but his father had also been terrified his entire life. Silas didn't want to live like that. He didn't want to spend the next 30 years looking over his shoulder and wondering what was true. He picked up the crowbar and wedged it under the first board. The nails groaned as he pulled, the wood cracked, and somewhere in the distance he heard the sound of an engine starting up on the ridge. They were watching. They knew what he was about to do, and they were coming to stop him. Silas pulled harder. The first board came free. Silas stopped when he heard the engine. He set the crowbar down and listened. The sound was coming from the ridge to the east, maybe half a mile away. A truck or SUV idling, watching. He looked at the cabin door. 1 board off. 7 more to go. If they came now, he wouldn't have time to finish. He picked up the crowbar again, then stopped. He needed help. Someone who knew what had really happened. Someone who had a reason to want the truth as much as he did. He threw the tools in the back of his truck and drove into town. It was almost dark when he pulled up in front of the small house on Mesquite Street. The address had been in the phone book under the name Ortiz. Only 1 listing. He knocked on the door and waited. The man who answered was around 40 with dark hair going gray at the temples and the kind of face that looked like it smiled often but wasn't smiling now. He looked at Silas for a long moment and something passed behind his eyes. Recognition maybe, or just careful assessment. "Can I help you?" he asked. Silas took a breath. "My name is Silas Drummond," he said. "I think your grandfather worked for mine." The man didn't move. After a moment he opened the door wider. "Come in," he said. Inside the house was small and neat, with bookshelves lining the walls and framed photographs on every surface. The man gestured to a couch. "I'm Mateo Ortiz," he said. "I teach history at the high school. And yes, my grandfather was Rafael Ortiz." Silas sat down. "I need to know what happened to him," he said. Mateo walked to the window and looked out at the street. "My grandfather came to Texas in 1946, he said. He was 28 years old. He worked the ranches during harvest season like everyone else, but he was different. He could read and write in 2 languages. He kept records. He asked questions. That's how he ended up working for your grandfather. They became friends, real friends. My grandmother said Raphael trusted him more than anyone." Mateo turned back to face Silas. "Then in October of 1947, my grandfather didn't come home. My grandmother went to the ranch to look for him. Your grandfather told her Raphael had left in the night, said he had gone back to Mexico. But Raphael would never have left without saying goodbye, and he would never have left without his wages. My grandmother knew something was wrong, but when she went to the sheriff, they told her to go home. They said migrant workers disappeared all the time. They said there was nothing they could do." Silas leaned forward. "But people blame my grandfather," he said. Mateo nodded. "The Barlows made sure of it," he said. "They spread the story that your grandfather had killed Raphael over a debt or an argument. They said he'd buried the body somewhere on the ranch. My family tried to fight it, but we had no money, no power, no proof. And the more we pushed, the more threats we got. Anonymous letters, men showing up at our door in the middle of the night. My grandmother finally stopped asking questions because she was afraid they'd kill the rest of us. She died 10 years ago, still believing Raphael was murdered, but she never believed your grandfather did it." Silas felt something loosen in his chest. "Then who?" he asked. Mateo walked to the bookshelf and pulled down a worn wooden box. He opened it and took out a folded piece of paper yellowed with age. "This is the last letter Raphael sent to my grandmother," he said. "It's dated October 7th, 1947, 2 days before he disappeared." Silas unfolded the letter carefully. The handwriting was neat and precise. It was written in Spanish, but Mateo translated as Silas read. "My dearest Maria," it said, "I have found something that I cannot ignore. There are men in this county who are stealing land from our people. They forge documents, threaten families, and when threats don't work, people disappear. I have collected evidence, contracts, letters, a list of families who have lost everything. Jasper has agreed to help me. He says we will take it to the authorities in Austin away from the corruption here. But I am afraid. These men are powerful. If something happens to me, look in the cabin. Jasper will keep everything safe there. I love you. I will come home soon." The letter ended there. Silas read it twice. Then he looked up at Mateo. He was trying to expose them, he said. "The Barlows." Mateo took the letter back and folded it carefully. "My grandmother believed that's why he was killed," he said. "And she believed your grandfather tried to save him. But something went wrong. Maybe they were discovered. Maybe there was a fight. We'll never know. After Raphael disappeared, your grandfather sealed the cabin and left town. No one ever saw him again. My family always wondered what was inside that cabin, but we were too afraid to go looking. The Barlows own this town. They own the law. If we tried to dig up the past, we would have ended up like Raphael." Silas stood. "I'm opening that cabin tonight," he said. "If there's evidence inside, I'm going to find it, and I'm going to make sure everyone knows the truth." Mateo stared at him. "They'll kill you," he said. Silas met his eyes. "Then help me," he said. "You're a teacher. You know how to research, how to document. If we do this together, they can't bury it again." Mateo was quiet for a long time. Then he walked to the closet and pulled out a heavy jacket. "Give me 10 minutes, he said. "I need to get my camera and a voice recorder. We're going to document everything. If something happens to us, at least there'll be a record." They drove back to the ranch in Silas's truck, Mateo in the passenger seat with a backpack full of equipment. The road was dark, and neither of them spoke much. When they pulled up to the cabin, Silas cut the engine and they sat in silence for a moment. The cabin looked smaller in the dark, more like a crypt than a building. The one board Silas had pulled off earlier was leaning against the wall. 7 more boards still covered the door. Mateo got out and walked up to the cabin slowly, like he was approaching a grave. He put his hand on the wood. "My grandfather was here," he said quietly. "He stood right here." Silas picked up the crowbar. "Then let's find out what he died for," he said. They worked together, prying off the boards one by one. The nails were old and rusted, but they held tight. It took 20 minutes to clear the door. When the last board came off, they stood back and looked at the entrance. The red wax seal was still intact across the seam. Silas took out a knife and started cutting through it. The wax cracked and fell away in chunks. Beneath it, the door was held shut by a single iron bolt. Silas pulled it back. The metal groaned. He looked at Mateo. "Ready?" he asked. Mateo nodded. Silas pushed the door open. The hinges screamed. The smell that came out was old and dry, like dust and wood and something else. Something that had been locked away for 77 years. Silas shined his flashlight inside. The beam cut through the darkness and landed on a table in the center of the room. On the table was a reel-to-reel tape recorder, a leather journal, and a wooden box. And on the wall behind the table, written in faded paint, were the words, "If you're reading this, I'm already dead. But the truth is here. Make them pay." Silas stepped inside first, his flashlight sweeping across the room. The cabin was small, maybe 12 feet by 12 feet, with no windows and walls made of thick oak logs. The air was stale but dry. Everything inside looked exactly as it had been left in 1947. A chair tucked under the table, a kerosene lamp on a shelf, a jacket hanging on a peg by the door. Mateo came in behind him, his camera already recording. He moved the lens slowly across the room, capturing everything. When the light hit the words on the wall, he stopped. "If you're reading this, I'm already dead. But the truth is here. Make them pay." The handwriting was sharp and angry, done in black paint with a brush. Mateo lowered the camera. "That's your grandfather's handwriting," he said quietly. "I've seen it in old documents at the county office." Silas nodded. He walked to the table and set his flashlight down so it illuminated the objects there. The tape recorder was a heavy military surplus model, the kind used for field recordings during the war. The reels were still loaded with tape, brown and brittle looking, but intact. Next to it was a leather journal, its cover cracked and dry. Silas opened it carefully. The first page was dated November 20th, 1947. The handwriting was hurried, uneven. "If anyone finds this, it begins knowing that I tried to do the right thing. Rafael Ortiz was my friend. He discovered something that powerful men wanted buried. I tried to protect him. I failed. What happened here 3 nights ago was murder, and I have the proof." Silas turned the page. There were names, dates, descriptions of land deals that had gone wrong, families who had lost their property to forged documents and intimidation. And at the bottom of the list, circled in red ink, was one name that appeared again and again: Barlow. Mateo was looking over his shoulder now, reading along. He pulled out his phone and started taking pictures of each page. "We need copies of everything he said. If they take this from us, we need backup." Silas nodded and turned to the wooden box. It was locked with a small padlock, but the metal was so rusted that it broke apart when he twisted it. Inside were documents, contracts, letters, deeds with signatures that didn't match. And at the bottom, a list of 17 families written in Rafael's neat handwriting. Next to each name was a date and a description: threatened, forced sale, disappeared. The last name on the list was Ortiz. Next to it, Rafael had written, "They know I have the evidence. If I don't make it, someone has to finish this." Mateo's hand shook as he photographed the page. "That's my grandfather's handwriting," he said. His voice was tight. "This is real. This is all real." Silas turned back to the tape recorder. He checked the reels. The tape looked fragile, but it was still threaded properly. He found the power cord coiled underneath the table and plugged it into a battery pack he'd brought from the truck. The machine hummed to life, the reels creaking as they started to turn. There was a long stretch of static, then a click, and then a voice. It was deep and steady, but there was fear in it, exhaustion. "My name is Jasper Drummond," the voice said. "Today is November 23rd, 1947. 3 nights ago, Rafael Ortiz was shot and killed on my property by men hired by the Barlow family. I'm recording this because I don't think I'm going to live long enough to see justice done. But someone needs to know what happened." Silas felt his throat tighten. That was his grandfather, a man he'd never met, a man who had been dead for 77 years. But his voice was alive in this room. The recording continued. "Rafael had been gathering evidence for months," the voice said. He'd found proof that the Barlows had been stealing land from Mexican-American families using forged deeds and bribed officials. When families resisted, they were threatened. Some were run off their land. Others disappeared. Rafael had names, documents, everything needed to bring them down. But someone in town found out. On the night of November 20th, 3 men came to the ranch. They demanded the evidence. Rafael refused. There was a fight. Shots were fired. Rafael was hit twice. He died in my arms before I could get him to a doctor. The men took his body. I don't know where, but I kept the evidence. I've sealed it in this cabin. If anyone opens this door, they'll know the truth. The tape hissed for a moment, then the voice came back quieter now. I'm leaving tonight. If I stay, they'll kill me too. But I'm not taking the evidence with me. It's safer here. Someday someone will find it, and when they do, I hope they have the courage to finish what Raphael started. The tape clicked off. Silas and Mateo stood in silence. The weight of what they'd just heard settled over them like a blanket. Then Mateo spoke. We need to get this out of here, he said. Now. We need to make copies, get it to the press, to the FBI, to anyone who'll listen. Silas started gathering the documents and putting them back in the box. He closed the journal and unplugged the tape recorder. Mateo kept filming, narrating everything they were doing. They were halfway to the door when they heard it. The sound of engines outside. Not one, multiple. Silas turned off his flashlight and moved to the doorway. Through the gap he could see headlights coming up the ranch road. 3 vehicles, maybe 4. They were moving fast. Mateo looked at him. What do we do? He asked. Silas grabbed the box and the tape recorder. We run, he said. They went out to the back of the cabin and into the brush. Silas led the way, moving fast through the mesquite and prickly pear, the box under one arm and the recorder in the other. Behind them, they could hear car doors slamming, voices. Someone shouted. Flashlights started sweeping across the property. Mateo was right behind him, the camera still in his hand. They made it to a dry creek bed about 200 yards from the cabin and dropped down into it. Silas set the box down and listened. The voices were closer now. He could hear boots on gravel. Someone was giving orders. Check the cabin. Find them. They can't have gone far. Silas looked at Mateo. We need to split up, he whispered. You take the camera and the journal. Get to your car and drive straight to Austin. Find a lawyer, a reporter, anyone. I'll keep the tape and the documents and lead them away from you. Mateo shook his head. That's suicide, he said. They'll kill you. Silas pressed the journal into his hands. If they catch both of us, this dies here, he said. Raphael died for this. Your family suffered for 77 years because of this. We're not letting them bury it again. Now go. Mateo stared at him for a long moment. Then he nodded, stuffed the journal in his backpack, and took off down the creek bed toward the east. Silas waited until he was out of sight. Then he grabbed the box and the tape recorder and ran west back toward the house. He could hear them behind him now, closer, flashlights cutting through the brush, a dog barking. He ran harder, his boots slipping on loose rock. When he broke through the tree line, he could see his truck parked near the house, 50 yards. He pushed himself, lungs burning. He was almost there when he heard the voice behind him. Stop right there! Silas didn't stop. He kept running. A gunshot cracked through the night, and the dirt exploded 2 feet to his left. He dove behind the truck and yanked the door open. He threw the box and the recorder inside and climbed in after them. The engine roared to life. He threw it in gear and punched the gas. The truck fishtailed tires, spitting gravel, and then he was moving. Another shot hit the tailgate. He kept going, racing down the ranch road with no headlights, just the moon and the memory of the road to guide him. In the rearview mirror, he saw headlights following. They were coming, and they weren't going to stop. Silas drove for 20 minutes before he was sure he'd lost them. He'd taken back roads through the hills, killed his headlights twice to let them pass on parallel routes, and finally doubled back through a dry riverbed that his father had shown him when he was a kid. By the time he pulled into the parking lot behind the high school, it was past midnight, and the town was dark. The teacher's car was already there, parked under a broken streetlight. Silas grabbed the box and the tape recorder and walked to the back entrance. The door opened before he could knock. The man pulled him inside quickly and locked the door behind them. Did they follow you? He asked. Silas shook his head. I lost them near the county line, he said. Did you make it out clean? The teacher held up his backpack. I got it all, he said. The journal, the photographs, everything. I made digital copies and uploaded them to 3 different cloud accounts. Even if they take the originals, the evidence is out there now. They walked down the dark hallway to a classroom in the back of the building. The teacher had set up a small work area with a laptop, a scanner, and a desk lamp. Silas set the tape recorder down on the desk and plugged it into the wall outlet. The machine hummed to life again, the reels turning slowly. The teacher opened the wooden box and started laying out the documents one by one, photographing each page with his phone. There were contracts with signatures that didn't match the names typed below them. Letters written on Barlow Land Trust, letterhead threatening families with legal action if they didn't sell. a handwritten ledger that listed payments made to county officials, judges, and a sheriff. It was all there. 77 years of corruption preserved in a sealed cabin because one man had been brave enough to hide it and another had died trying to protect it. Silas rewound the tape to the beginning and pressed play. His grandfather's voice filled the small classroom again, steady and clear, despite the hiss of old magnetic tape. "My name is Jasper Drummond. Today is November 23rd, 1947. The teacher stopped what he was doing and listened. They both did. The recording was longer than Silas had realized. His grandfather went through everything methodically, naming names, describing incidents, laying out the entire conspiracy. He talked about how the Barlows had been targeting Mexican-American families who held land grants from the Spanish colonial period. Families who had been on their land for generations, but didn't have the English literacy or legal knowledge to defend themselves in court. The Barlows would approach them with offers to buy. If they refused, the threats would start. Livestock would disappear, fences would be cut, houses would burn. And when fear didn't work, the Barlows would forge documents showing that the land had been sold or seized for unpaid taxes. By the time the families realized what had happened, it was too late. Raphael had started documenting it all after his own cousin lost a 100-acre farm to a forged deed. He'd gone from family to family, collecting stories, copying documents, building a case. He'd brought it to Jasper because he needed someone who spoke English fluently and had standing in the community, someone the authorities might actually listen to. They'd planned to take everything to the state attorney general's office in Austin, but someone had found out. On the night of November 20th, 3 men showed up at the ranch. Jasper's voice went quiet for a moment on the tape, and when it came back, it was strained. "I didn't recognize the 2 of them," he said, "but the 3rd one I knew. His name was Coleman Barlow. He's the one who shot Raphael. He shot him twice in the chest and once in the head after he went down. Then he told me if I said anything, my family would be next. They took Raphael's body and they left. I buried the evidence here, and I'm leaving tonight. I don't know if I'll ever be able to come back. But if anyone finds this, you have to know Raphael Ortiz was a hero. And the Barlows are murderers." The tape clicked off. Silas sat down heavily in one of the student desks. He felt like someone had punched him in the stomach. His grandfather hadn't killed anyone. He'd witnessed a murder and spent the rest of his life running from it. The teacher was standing by the window, his arms crossed, staring out at the empty parking lot. "Coleman Barlow," he said. "That would be Garrett's grandfather. He died in 1983. Natural causes, supposedly. Never faced charges for anything." Silas looked up. "What about the other 2 men?" he asked. The teacher shook his head. "No way to know," he said. "But I'd bet they were employees, hired guns, men who did the Barlows' dirty work and got paid to keep quiet." Silas stood and walked to the desk. He picked up the ledger and flipped through it. The payments went back to 1942, 5 years of bribes, threats, and theft. And at the bottom of the last page there was a list, 17 names, 17 families who'd lost everything. The teacher came over and looked at the list. "My family is number 9, he said quietly. "My great-grandfather's name is right there, Esteban Ortiz. They took his land in 1946. He died 2 years later, broken and poor. My grandmother said he never recovered from it." Silas closed the ledger. "We have everything we need," he said. "We have the recording, the documents, the journal. We can take this to the FBI, the state police, the newspapers. We can make sure everyone knows what the Barlows did." The teacher nodded, but he didn't look convinced. "It's been 77 years, he said. "Most of the people involved are dead. Garrett can claim he had no knowledge of what his grandfather did. He'll say it's ancient history, and we're just trying to extort him." Silas met his eyes. "Then we make it public," he said. "We don't go to the authorities first. We go to the people. We call a town meeting. We play the tape. We show the documents. We let the community decide what kind of people they want to do business with." The teacher thought about it for a long moment. Then he nodded. "There's a public forum at the community center every month," he said. "The next one is in 3 days. It's open to anyone. If we can get people to show up, we can present everything." Silas picked up the tape recorder. 3 days, he said. "Can you keep this safe until then?" The teacher took the recorder and the box of documents. "I'll lock them in the school safe," he said. "It's fireproof and bolted to the floor. No one's getting to them without me knowing." Silas started to leave, then stopped. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. "You could have stayed quiet. You could have stayed safe." The teacher looked down at the list of names. "Because my grandfather died believing justice would never come," he said. "And my family has lived in shame for 77 years because people thought he was a criminal. I'm tired of being quiet. I'm tired of letting them get away with it." Silas nodded. "Then let's finish what our grandfather started," he said. He left through the back door and drove home slowly, checking his mirrors every few seconds. The ranch was dark when he pulled up. He parked the truck behind the house and sat there for a minute, listening to the engine tick as it cooled. Then he got out and walked to the cabin. The door was still open, the boards scattered on the ground. Inside, the table was empty now. The words on the wall were still there, faded and accusatory. "If you're reading this, I'm already dead. But the truth is here. Make them pay." Silas stood in the doorway and looked at the message. His grandfather had written those words knowing he'd never see justice himself. He'd written them as a prayer, a hope that someday someone would care enough to finish the fight. Silas pulled the door closed and walked back to the house. 3 days. In 3 days, the whole town would know the truth, and the Barlows would have nowhere left to hide. The community center was packed. Silas stood at the back of the room and counted heads. At least 200 people, maybe more. Most of them were locals, ranchers, and shop owners, and families who had lived in the county for generations. But there were others, too. A reporter from the Austin paper sat in the third row with a notebook. A woman with a camera from the local TV station set up near the front. And in the back corner, arms crossed and face like stone, stood the silver-haired man and his lawyer. They'd come because they had to, because not showing up would have looked like guilt. Silas caught the businessman's eye across the room. The man stared back cold and measuring. Then he looked away. The moderator called the meeting to order and ran through the usual business. Budget reports, road maintenance, a complaint about stray dogs. Then she looked at her list and frowned. "We have a special presentation tonight," she said. "Silas Drummond has requested time to address the community regarding a historical matter." She looked up. "Mr. Drummond, you have the floor." Silas walked to the front of the room, and the teacher followed him, carrying a cardboard box. They set it on the table. Silas looked out at the crowd. Some faces were curious, others were skeptical, a few looked hostile. He took a breath. "My name is Silas Drummond," he said. "My grandfather was Jasper Drummond. Most of you know that name. Most of you were told he was a murderer. He killed a man named Rafael Ortiz in 1947, and then ran. I'm here tonight to tell you that's a lie." There was a murmur in the crowd. The businessman shifted in his seat. His lawyer leaned over and whispered something to him. Silas continued. 3 days ago, I opened a cabin on my family's property that had been sealed since 1947. Inside, I found evidence that my grandfather left behind. Evidence that proves what really happened. He nodded to the teacher who pulled the tape recorder out of the box and set it on the table. "This is a recording my grandfather made 2 days after Rafael Ortiz was killed," Silas said. "I'm going to play it for you now, and when it's done, you can decide for yourselves who the real murderers are." He pressed play. The room went silent. His grandfather's voice filled the space steady and clear, despite the years. "My name is Jasper Drummond. Today is November 23rd, 1947. 3 nights ago, Rafael Ortiz was shot and killed on my property by men hired by the Barlow family. People leaned forward in their seats. The reporter started writing. The TV camera turned on its red light, glowing. The tape played for 10 minutes, laying out everything. The forged deeds, the threats, the bribes, the murder. When it got to the part where Jasper named Coleman Barlow as the shooter, the room erupted. People started talking all at once. The moderator banged her gavel, but no one was listening. The businessman stood up, his face red. "This is slander," he shouted. "That recording is fake. It's a desperate attempt by a failed family to extort money from mine." His voice carried across the room, but it had lost its authority. People were looking at him differently now, not with respect or fear, but with suspicion, with disgust. Silas waited for the noise to die down, then spoke again, his voice calm and measured. "Then explain these," he said. The teacher started pulling documents out of the box and holding them up one by one. Forged contracts, ledgers showing bribes paid to county officials, letters threatening families. Each one was photographed and displayed on a screen the teacher had set up. The audience watched in silence as document after document appeared, names they recognized, signatures that didn't match, threats written in cold, businesslike language. "And this," Silas said, holding up the list. 17 families who lost their land to your family between 1942 and 1948. He read the names aloud slowly, giving each one weight. Martinez, Gonzalez, Reyes, Ortiz, Herrera. With each name, someone in the crowd shifted or looked down or whispered to the person next to them. These weren't just names on paper. They were neighbors, relatives, people whose stories had been buried for decades. The teacher stepped forward. "My name is Mateo Ortiz," he said. "I'm Rafael Ortiz's grandson. My family is number 9 on that list. We lost 80 acres in 1946 to a forged deed. We were told we had no recourse. We were told to stay quiet or face consequences. And we did. For 77 years we stayed quiet. But I'm done being quiet." His voice broke slightly on the last words, but he didn't look away from the crowd. He held their gaze, his chin up, his shoulders back. There was movement in the crowd. An old man stood up slowly, leaning on a cane. He had to be 90, at least his face weathered and lined. "My name is Virgil Whitfield," he said. His voice was thin but clear. "My grandfather disappeared in 1948. He owned 120 acres south of town. One day he was there, the next day he was gone. The Barlows claimed he had sold them the land and moved away. But my grandmother never believed it. She said he would have told us. She said he would have said goodbye." He looked at the businessman. "Your family has been stealing and killing for 3 generations, and everyone in this town has been too scared to say it out loud." The room went quiet again. The weight of those words settled over everyone. Then another person stood. A woman in her 60s with gray hair pulled back in a bun. "My uncle lost his ranch in 1953, she said. "He died 6 months later. Heart attack, they said. But my mother always said it was a broken heart." And another, a younger man, maybe 40, with work-worn hands. "My great-grandfather's name is on that list," he said. "I grew up thinking he was a failure, that he'd lost everything because he couldn't manage money. But it was a theft. It was always theft." Within 2 minutes, 6 people were on their feet, all of them with stories about land-lost families, threatened relatives who'd disappeared. The businessman's face had gone pale. His lawyer was pulling at his sleeve, whispering urgently, but he didn't move. He stood there, trapped by the weight of his family's sins, while the community he'd controlled for so long turned against him. The reporter was writing furiously. The TV camera kept rolling. The businessman looked around the room, and for the first time Silas saw something in his face that looked like fear. The lawyer grabbed his arm and pulled him toward the door. They pushed through the crowd and left without another word. No one tried to stop them. No one said goodbye. They just watched them go, and when the door closed behind them, someone in the back of the room started clapping. Then another person joined in. And another. Within seconds, the whole room was applauding. The moderator banged her gavel again. "This meeting is adjourned," she said. But no one moved. People gathered around Silas and the teacher, looking at the documents, asking questions, and sharing their own stories. The reporter came over and asked if she could make copies of everything. Silas handed her the box. "Make as many as you need," he said. "Take it all. The truth belongs to everyone now." By morning, the story was everywhere. The Austin paper ran it on the front page. The TV station led their broadcast with it. Within hours, it had spread to the national news. By the end of the week, the FBI had opened an investigation into land fraud in the county. Federal agents arrived with warrants and subpoenas. They seized records from the Barlow Land Trust offices. They interviewed dozens of witnesses. They dug through 70 years of transactions and found the same pattern repeated again and again: fraud, intimidation, theft. And by the end of the month, the Barlow family's empire started to crumble. The businessman was arrested on multiple counts of fraud and conspiracy. His assets were frozen, the land trust was dissolved, and the families who had been robbed finally had a chance to reclaim what had been stolen from them. 2 months later, Silas stood in front of the cabin at sunrise. The boards were gone now, stacked neatly behind the building. The door hung open on new hinges. Inside, the table and chairs had been cleaned and repaired. The words on the wall, the ones his grandfather had painted in 1947, were still there. "If you're reading this, I'm already dead. But the truth is here. Make them pay." Silas had decided to leave them. They were part of the story now, part of the memorial. He heard footsteps behind him and turned. The teacher was walking up the path with a cardboard box under his arm. Behind him, an older woman followed slowly, her hand on his shoulder for balance. She was small and gray-haired, with the kind of face that had seen hard years but hadn't let them break her. Silas walked over to meet them. The teacher set the box down and gestured to the woman. "This is my aunt," he said. "Raphael's daughter. She wanted to be here today." The woman looked at Silas for a long moment. Then she reached out and took his hand. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was soft but steady. "My father died before I was born. I grew up hearing stories about him, but I never knew the truth. I thought he'd done something wrong. I thought that's why people didn't talk about him. But now I know. He was a good man. He was trying to help people, and your grandfather tried to save him." Silas squeezed her hand gently. "I'm sorry it took so long," he said. She shook her head. "You did what no one else could," she said. "You opened the door." That took courage, more courage than most people have. She let go of his hand and walked toward the cabin. She stood in the doorway for a moment looking inside. Then she stepped in, and Silas watched as she ran her fingers along the table where her father had once sat. Over the next hour, more people arrived. Families who'd lost land, descendants of the 17 names on the list. Some brought flowers, others brought photographs of relatives they'd never met. They walked through the cabin quietly reading the words on the wall, looking at the documents that Silas had framed and hung beside them. The teacher had helped him set it up. They'd turned the cabin into a memorial, a place where the truth could be told and remembered. On one wall there was a timeline of the Barlow family's crimes. On another, photographs of the families who had been affected. And in the center of the room on the table sat the tape recorder, with a handwritten sign that said, "Press play." One by one, people listened to the recording. Some cried, others stood in silence, their faces hard. But all of them heard it. The voice of a man who'd risked everything to tell the truth. Outside, Silas stood with the teacher and watched the people come and go. The FBI investigation had moved quickly once the story broke. Federal agents had seized records from the Barlow Land Trust and interviewed dozens of witnesses. They'd found evidence of land fraud going back decades, not just in the 40s, but continuing into the 80s and 90s. The businessman had been arrested 3 weeks ago on charges of fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. His lawyer had been arrested too. The family's assets were frozen. The land trust was being dissolved, and the families who had been robbed were finally getting a chance to reclaim what had been stolen. It wasn't perfect. Some of the land had been sold to third parties years ago, people who had had no knowledge of the fraud. Those cases would take years to sort out. But it was a start. It was justice, even if it had come 77 years late. The teacher pulled an envelope out of his jacket and handed it to Silas. "This came yesterday," he said. "It's from the State Historical Society. They want to designate the cabin as an official historical site. They'll help maintain it and add it to the state registry." Silas opened the envelope and skimmed the letter. At the bottom was a line that made him stop. "We believe this site represents an important chapter in Texas history and should be preserved for future generations as a testament to the courage of those who fought for justice in the face of overwhelming power." He folded the letter and put it back in the envelope. "Raphael and my grandfather would have liked that," he said. The teacher nodded. "They died trying to do the right thing," he said. "Now everyone will know. That matters. That matters more than anything." By noon, most visitors were gone. Silas returned to the cabin and found the old woman still inside, tears on her face as she held a photograph. When he turned to leave, she called softly, "Stay." She showed him the picture his grandfather and Raphael young and alive. They were friends, she said. Dreamers who believed people deserved dignity no matter where they came from. Dreamers don't last long in a world run by men like the Barlows. But their dream did. It lived because your grandfather hid the truth, and you found it. You gave my father his name, his dignity, and my family peace. Silas looked at the photograph. He thought about his own father, who'd spent his whole life afraid, who'd died warning him not to open the cabin, who'd carried the weight of his father's secret until it killed him. "I wish my father could have seen this," Silas said. "I wish he could have known it was safe to tell the truth." The woman reached across the table and put her hand on his. "He knew," she said. "He just didn't have the strength to do it himself. But he raised a son who did. That's not failure, that's legacy." They sat together in the quiet cabin for a while longer. Then the woman stood and walked to the door. She stopped in the doorway and looked back at the words on the wall. "Make them pay," she read aloud. Then she smiled. "You did," she said. "You made them pay. And you set us all free." After she left, Silas stayed in the cabin a while longer. He brushed the dust from the painted letters, his grandfather's handwriting, his final message. He wondered what it had felt like to write those words, knowing he'd never see them answered, leaving everything behind for a truth that might never surface. It was a sacrifice without reward, but it had mattered. It still did. Silas closed the door and stepped into the sunlight. The Texas sky stretched wide and blue above land his family had built with work and defended with truth, finally free of lies. He called the Historical Society and told them he'd accept. The cabin would stand as it was. The story would be told. Anyone could come and see what had been hidden. When he hung up, the weight he'd carried all his life began to lift. His grandfather had asked someone to make them pay, and Silas had done it not through violence or revenge, but through the one thing they could never control: the truth. He walked home as the sun climbed higher, the cabin behind him standing open to the wind, a reminder that justice, though late, had finally arrived.
From all of us here at QA Stories, thank you for watching. Smash that like button, drop a comment, and join us again for more unbelievable stories.